Welcome to Inside IR, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills that explores the latest developments in the Australian industrial relations landscape.
Hello and welcome to Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast, the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest industrial relations thinking. My name's not Rowan Doyle, but please don't switch off because we've still got an excellent episode for you today. My name is Natalie Gaspar. I'm one of the partners in the National Employment, Industrial Relations and Safety team, and I'm joined by my good friend and our managing partner, Steve Bell. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Natalie. Nice to be here. Long time listener, first time attendee. So delighted to be on the podcast.
Oh, it's terrific. So Steve and I have been doing quite a bit of work together, actually. There's an increasing crossover between our respective practices as a traditional IR specialist and Steve with his traditional work health and safety practice. Yep. And, one of the things that we wanted to discuss and we have been discussing with clients lately, Steve, is the brand new right to disconnect. So
much spoken about.
It is.
To disconnect.
It has really...
An exercise in excellent branding, I think, if nothing else.
Well, this is something that has, as you say, been spoken about quite a bit in the mainstream media, and it's gotten people quite excited. So there is a right to disconnect in other jurisdictions, in some EU countries as it is, but what the right to disconnect in Australia is different from that. And I think there's a fair degree of paranoia, perhaps amongst the business community, about what this might mean. So let's do some myth busting,
sure.
Steve.
So how do you describe it to clients when they ask you what this right is?
So the right to I describe it by describing what it's not. So a right to disconnect is not an absolute prohibition on contacting people out of hours.
Yeah.
What it is it provides employees with the right to refuse to monitor or respond to contact, either from their employer or third parties. So that might be clients, for example, outside of their ordinary hours of work. Other than, and this is the important part, in circumstances where that refusal is unreasonable. So what it does is it gives an employee a right that they need to positively engage. So if they refuse to monitor, there then becomes a focus on the reasonableness of that refusal. Now, Steve, this is where...
So we are, in the post-pandemic era, we are being contacted in many professions. We're in professional services, but lots of our clients have moved to a new flexible world. We're on iPhones, we're on other devices, we're getting emails constantly. So is that wrong now? Is that unlawful, or has something different changed?
No, so this is the thing. So there's two things. As Australians, many people have been able to embrace the flexibility and the great flexibility that goes with being able to design your day around the work, and part of that is having, quite frankly, sensible conversations with your employees about what the expectations are.
Yep.
Can I answer that question by just reminding listeners, the genesis for this is really about preventing employee burnout at work, right?
Yeah.
Harm. It is about minimising harm to workplaces. So the situation which you're describing, where someone spends some time in the office, goes home, does the kids pick up and, sorts the house out and then jumps on later to do their work. That's not harm. In fact, the opposite. That is helping that individual.
Yep.
So it's not about that. But it does require employers to, I think, fairly consider about what is reasonable for that particular employee.
Is this every employee? Or is it just
it
award-covered employees? The question, I guess.
It's not partners.
No, right. That's true. I'm no longer an employee.
No, that's right. It is. It's all Australian employees, regardless. So there is no income threshold. It is a question that we are often asked for that.
But even we health and safety lawyers have seen that there is a model award term. So how does that work?
The model award term has just been announced and will be implemented into all modern awards. It largely reflects the legislation.
Right.
So again, what it does is require employees, and that assessment of reasonableness is really subjective. And it depends upon the particular circumstances of the individual who's exercising that right at any given time. So the sorts of things that are taken into account, Steve, are why the contact is made, how it is made, at what time of day is it made, the method by which it's made, the employee's role and their circumstances. So again, thinking about us, If a client was to contact one of our lawyers out of traditional business hours, because there is a picket forming at their site and we need to prepare urgent injunctive material, sure, clearly that's reasonable in the circumstances. Some businesses are, for what it's worth, amending their employment contracts to positively just make it clear for employees what the expectations are about out-of-hours conduct and the reasonableness. So,
and that is not about creating a whole regime of unpaid work. It's just about acknowledging, as I understand it, that there are times in which it's appropriate for people to be as contactable as we know they are and to be able to respond, but not to go so far as to make it unreasonable. And that's I think, the way in which the law's been drafted as well.
I think that's right. And so what the laws also do is provide protections for employees so that they do, if they do actually exercise their right, they are not discriminated against or treated less favourably, again, understandably so. So the right to disconnect is formally recognised as a protected attribute for the general protections regime.
It
won't surprise.
But it's interesting though, isn't it? Because it's a right that is bounded up with this concept of what's reasonable or what's perceived to be unreasonable, which is all pretty subjective. Most of the other rights are pretty black and white, as I would read them. There is still this degree of flexibility which is expected, a degree of reasonableness and a discussion about that. And doesn't the legislation say the first port of call is actually a discussion between a manager and their worker? That's the way in which this is intended to facilitate sensible workplace conversations.
It is not
expectations
dissimilar to the bullying regime, right?
Yeah.
Where there is a mechanism, there is an expectation for the Fair Work Commission that attempts are made to resolve that, a triaging process, so to speak. But if that's ineffectual, there is the ability for employees to go to the Fair Work Commission and to seek a stop order. And if a stop order is made, to be honest, I can't perceive many instances where that is made. I don't think we're going to have the floodgates, right? So again, when this bullying jurisdiction became part of the Fair Work Act, it sits parallel to the work health and safety laws. Again, there was a great apprehension that there would be this floodgate of applications being made. There are some and they're few and reasonably so, but so too I suspect with this right to disconnect regime, Steve.
Well, I mean, the bullying regime was intended, I think, to take the burden off state safety regulators and to create its own special regime. To be perfectly frank, I see more health and safety regulatory investigations in relation to bullying than I see the Fair Work jurisdiction dealing with it. And I perceive the right to disconnect discussion about what's reasonable at work, what is harmful, what is too much, what is expected. I see that as well being part of the discussion about the new concept of psychosocial risk, which is now black letter expectations in work health and safety laws. So every Australian employer, with the exception of those in Victoria, but it's coming, has an obligation to positively think through things at work that might cause psychosocial harm. The way I'm describing it to clients is non-physical risk. What are the ways in which you're designing work, allocating work, giving proper supervision to people performing roles, dealing with interpersonal conduct issues, thinking about customers, thinking about third parties. Positive obligation to lay that out, to say, well, these are the sorts of things that can cause harm in our organisation. Do we think we're doing enough? But as ever, it's about doing what's reasonably practicable. It's not about saying we have to eliminate stress from the workplace. I mean, it's interesting, you're saying, when you and I speak to boards, there's a lot of questions about the right to disconnect. It's perceived to be something that's really fundamentally going to change the way in which people work. And I have this discussion too about the expectation on psychosocial risks. Does this mean that we can't be stressed at work anymore? Does it mean that we can't expect high performance or stretch from workers? But I don't see it that way. I see the expectation is about reducing harm, having an honest conversation about things that can be harmful, and then asking, what are we doing about it, and can we do more?
Yes, and so looking at that lens, if you're, I'm interested to hear what you're practically saying to this, because a lot of the responsibility for dealing with the right to disconnect, for example, in organisations are sitting with the traditional HR HR practitioners. What does that look like? And what you're describing is this risk assessment language. How do
Which is new. It's new for the HR team. It is a new paradigm through which they're doing familiar things, and I think that's an aspect of what I'm seeing as well. So thinking about psychosocial risk, clients says to me, what should they do? I think the response is multidisciplinary in a way that probably most health and safety things have not been in the past. But it is the discipline of the rigour of risk management, which often sits with the health and safety team. It's the clarity about the way in which people work and what the available ways are to think through practically how people can thrive at work and be successful at work. That's often the P&C team. Thinking about how the story of the lived experience at work is telling us whether we're getting it right or wrong. That can be the workers' comp team, it can be the reportable conduct team, those in operations, the workers themselves, should be consulted in relation to this. So it's just a really interesting time that I do think there's a high degree of overlap now in what would have otherwise been traditionally more kind of siloed areas of accountability.
I think that's right. And I'm not sure about your reflection, Steve, but unions and employees are starting to pick up this language.
Yeah.
When they're talking about what this looks like. So there is a bit more sophistication and awareness about people, about things like job design and burnout stress and
I agree.
those sorts of things as well.
I mean, probably if we think about traditional health and safety risk, traditionally an employer, through the various devices, including consultation, has gone through a process of thinking about risk, implementing controls, and then training people on them or telling people about them. So the knowledge sits at the sort of enterprise level and is communicated to the workers. I reckon that is getting a bit inverted at the moment. There is a clearer, and this is no bad thing, but a clearer understanding from workers about what is a fair go at work, what are reasonable expectations, what are the sorts of hazards that can arise that can cause harm, and they're putting it back on the employer. And so we're at this funny moment where an employer has all this work to do to think through the risk assessment process, reflect on what's reasonable after hours contact, think about positive duty of sexual harassment. There's a range of new things that are happening at the enterprise level. But I think the workforce is already ahead of that. And this is the moment, I think, where there's some risk for business if they're not able to show that they've started the process of thinking this through and having a plan in place.
So you're not, are you suggesting to our clients that... Are you or are you not? Are you suggesting to our clients that do I need to conduct a risk assessment before I pick up the phone or send an email to one of the lawyers in our team after 5:30 p.m?
No, but as part of management, as part of leadership, we should be reflecting on our understanding of what are the things that are reasonable role expectations, about what are the things that we're communicating to the workforce in terms of what we're required to do, and we should work within those rails. Now, that's no revolutionary concept, I don't think. I actually think that's a description of a business that is being run well, that is thinking this stuff through in advance, is having a positive position and dealing with that. That's the risk assessment, I think. It's not that we need to be anxiously avoiding contact with each other or robotically engaging with each other in case we all say the wrong thing or we do the wrong thing. I think that's the fear, to be honest, that we end up in that sort of position. But it is interesting, I think, that there is a perception at the moment, or a potential for one, that we are over-regulating these areas to the detriment of good enterprise, of successful business, of making Australia an investable country. But there is a real risk, I think, that phrases like psychosocial risk and the right to disconnect are getting kind of extrapolated to mean, well, does this mean we are the new France, with the new 37-hour week where everyone clocks off? And I don't see it that way.
Yes.
But it's important, I think, for us all collectively to be clear on what it is and to communicate that.
And so, I mean, what's the answer? It's having conversations, right?
Yep.
And part of that, a lot of what we're talking about here, there's kind of common sense approach, but it is what the legislation dictates, from a traditional work health and safety perspective. It's about consulting with workers.
Indeed,
and having those sorts of conversations. And there will be different occasions where things are reasonable in one particular circumstance, and precisely that same person the next week, in exactly that same circumstance, it might not be reasonable for reasons known and unknown. So I think part of this as well...
We were talking about this in the lead up to this chat, where we observed that the Fair Work Commission itself is not putting guidelines out on the right to disconnect because of that variability, because of that nuance, I think. And it's kind of telling too that I think that speaks to, this is not intended to be a black letter concept. It's not intended to be bright lines. It's intended to be nuanced. And just like psychosocial risk, I see it the same way. there's an expectation here for a sensible discussion about what's reasonable.
Yeah, that's right. And so just to punctuate Steve's point, when the Fair Work Commission released the model terms, which will be written into every single modern award, there were submissions from all around the country as to what the right to disconnect term should involve. Unsurprisingly, employee groups and unions were pushing for quite a fair degree of rigour in relation to that, and for certain things to be specified as to what's out of bounds and what's in bounds and the like. The Fair Work Commission has decided not to adopt that, and as we said earlier, they've largely reflected what is the legislative regime. There has been a commitment or an indication from the Fair Work Commission that a review would be conducted in approximately 12 months' time as to the term. And as you said, initially there was an expectation that there would be guidelines put out, and that they've held off for that reason, specifically saying we're just going to wait and see what sort of disputes come before us so that we can sensibly provide some guidance for business. So, as we kind of wrap up this conversation, Steve, I don't think we can be telling you, dear listeners, that you must do A, B, C, D, X, Y, and Z.
No, I think that's right.
It is an evolving conversation. It is just taking a bit of a common sense approach. Do you know what? Am I about to burn out my people here? And we were saying different jobs and the nature of the work is different. So you will have people who are covered by enterprise agreements where there is a lot of rigidity in relation to their particular hours of work. There'll be provisions in the modern award with respect to overtime and call-out allowances and standby and rosters. That's going to look very different to a professional services firm where, again, you say, people enjoy the flexibility, the quid pro quo that goes with that. They have agency in relation to how they design their day. So, I mean, what are we saying? What are you saying to clients?
Well, the work we're doing in this area is on a couple of levels. First, I think there's a thirst for knowledge at the board level. We're speaking to, I know you and I are doing this a lot, but speaking to directors about what do these changes mean? How should they calibrate their expectations of management? What should they be looking for? What are the indicia of good activity? What are the signals of good reporting on these sorts of issues? Work conduct, the way in which work's designed and resourced, the way in which we're managing expectations like after-hours contact and the requirements of workers in that regard. So first level, I think, is an education level, and there's a lot of that happening for the sorts of businesses that we deal with at the board level. I think at a management level, just as you've described, there is a need to be really focused on the operationalisation of this that is not dramatic, but also doesn't ignore the fact that we are moving into a new era, I think, of an increased sophistication about what an employee's expectations are and what the expectations are on an employer to manage that sort of non-physical harm.
Yes.
And practically what I'm seeing clients do, and I know we talked about risk assessments on this chat, is ask that question: what are the cohorts across our workforce that have pretty common experiences at work in terms of the way in which their jobs are designed, their expectations of their supervisors, the sorts of people they're interacting with, the sorts of hours they might need to work and their stressors at work. Chunking the business up into those kind of meaningful cohorts, and then, intuitively having a sense of what are the primary psychosocial risks. Some of it might be after hours contact. To be honest, it's not. When I talk to clients, it's rarely the main issue. Test that intuition with each of those cohorts, chat to that workforce and have a bit of clarity about what the primary psychosocial areas of concern might be and do something about it. And that isn't to suggest that an organisation can achieve an absolute state of perfection on these issues overnight. I just don't think that's reasonable. And where you want to be in the event that a worker is challenging you or a regulator is to demonstrate commitment to a plan and have that plan triaged at a risk-weighted level. The things that we think are really likely to be impactful and harmful, let's get onto those, and then progressively we'll improve the overall way in which we're thinking about work.
Yeah, terrific. All right, well, thank you, Steve. It's always great having your insights. And as we said, we're doing so much together in this space, everything from the positive duty in respect of sexual harassment and these are all good things. I think there's a bit of rigour that needs to go around the thinking and a bit of infrastructure in the procedure. But at the end of the day, look, this is about making sure that your people aren't hurt.
Sure.
whilst they're in workplace. There is just a broader definition as to what hurt is, I suppose, and a new way of thinking in relation to that.
Okay.
So terrific. Now, as always, we'd love to hear any feedback that you have or suggestions for future episodes.
Sure.
So slide into our DMs on LinkedIn. You can also email us at insideir@hsf.com. Thanks as always for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.
Thanks, Nat. Well done.